Okay, hello everyone. There are a few people still joining. Thank you all for joining us today for this important and timely discussion focusing on Palestinian youth mobilization in the Sheikh Jarrah era and assessing this new wave in Palestinian politics. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I'm the Assistant Executive Director and Senior Research Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I am pleased to welcome all of you to today's webinar featuring a lineup of impressive analysts and activists. Unfortunately, Salim Barahma was not able to join us. He is not feeling well today. He is the Executive Director of the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, but we have three other excellent speakers that I look forward to hearing from. We do apologize for this last minute change, but we hope Salim feels better, and I've expanded my remarks a little bit, just a heads up in case you think this is a little too long. So following the events in the last few weeks in Palestine, we at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Sought to organize this webinar to discuss the emergence of a new and the future implications of this newly energized and unified activism by Palestinian youth, both in historic Palestine and throughout the diaspora. As most of you know, the recent wave of protests and violence started when a group of young people in Sheikh Jarrah held nightly protests against the Israeli displacement and ethnic cleansing of 8 families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem. These protests were in the form of sit-ins. The young people came together to break the Ramadan fast. They sat together and they sang. This comes after a month earlier, popular protests by young people outside Damascus Gate in Jerusalem pushed Israel to remove the divider fences that they placed to prevent Palestinians, especially young people, from sitting on the stairs there. So these acts of just sitting by young people in Sheikh Jarrah and outside Damascus Gate were met with violent attacks and arrests by the Israeli army and police and by harassments from the settlers. Against this backdrop, what followed is the Israeli police entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, assaulted worshippers during the holiest night of Ramadan, which triggered further outrage and anger throughout the occupied territories and for Palestinians inside Israel. Hamas launched rockets from the besieged Gaza Strip, and Israel started an 11-day intense bombardment and destruction of Gaza that killed more than 250 Palestinians, including 65 children, and forcibly displaced 72,000 people in the Gaza Strip, many of whom for the second, third, or even fourth time. 12 Israelis were killed by Hamas rockets. Also, in cities across Israel, violence soared, and Palestinian citizens were targeted by lynch mobs organized by extremists and Israeli settlers. They organized these attacks on WhatsApp and Telegram, and even shared names and times and locations of the Palestinians to attack. The Israeli police made 75 arrests and 170 charges, the majority of whom were disproportionately of Palestinians. As the series of events was unfolding, the Palestinian Authority was largely absent from the scene, doing little beyond issuing statements of condemnation, which is the usual. And in this context, the Palestinian youth filled this vacuum. The absence of the Palestinian Authority's intervention in Jerusalem in particular, and maybe the absence of the outdated strategies of the Palestinian political parties may have presented an opportunity here for grassroots mobilizations in the city. What is remarkable about this wave of mobilization is perhaps the return to decentralized grassroots organizing after more than 2 decades of authoritarian measures in cooperation with the Israeli occupation forces. by the Palestinian Authority after the Oslo Accords. This resulted in the marginalization, the huge marginalization of civil society organization, and especially young people who have become disillusioned with the Palestinian leadership, and maybe even more so after President Mahmoud Abbas canceled the elections. So Palestinians from across the occupied territories, Israel, and the diaspora communities around the world, especially young people, mobilized and rallied together, holding strikes, protests, marches, sharing their experiences and histories on social media, and even some driving for hours to Jerusalem to support the people of Sheikh Jarrah. Young Palestinians, especially from Sheikh Jarrah, who grew up under the threat of displacement, took leadership and mobilized using social media tools, providing around-the-clock reporting, organizing protests on these tools, and broadcasting online on TikTok and other media platforms across the world. These were largely leaderless and without political affiliation. These young people were able to connect and reunite the fragmented Palestinian communities in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, and the Palestinian diaspora. Dubbed the TikTok generation, these Palestinian young people used social media like TikTok, Instagram, WhatsApp, and other apps to bypass mainstream media gatekeeping, Palestinian Authority measures to silence them, and the violent Israeli fragmentation of the Palestinian populations. This energized Palestinian resistance took many forms. We saw young Palestinians posing and smiling as they were being arrested, while others held concerts near Israeli checkpoints and at different places throughout the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Israel, and Gaza as well. There is no doubt that social media played an important role in helping young Palestinians report on the events and disseminate live videos, pictures, and memes to beat the censorship of tech companies that have been well documented to work in cooperation with the repressive Israel security unit, cyber unit that works with the Israeli government. Some even consider the easily digestible video clips and live streams on TikTok to be game changers. And young Palestinians everywhere mobilized in unity and simultaneously to a degree that we have not seen in decades. So organizing, joining protests, strikes, boycotts, civil action, demanding the basic rights and freedoms of the Palestinian people, and framing their challenges as one shared struggle. And this is beyond the failed framework of the two-state solution, and in defiance to the failed Palestinian leadership and the toothless international community. And now, as the ceasefire went into effect on May 21st, and the world went back to ignoring the ongoing Israeli occupation and apartheid policies, where is this energized youth mobilization heading? Does this momentum reflect a changing Palestinian political consensus and a new Palestinian strategy? Is this a transformative moment in the struggle for Palestinian rights and for the freedom of Palestinian people and the Palestinian national movement as well? Can a new young leadership in Palestine emerge outside the traditional political parties? And looking at the international community, are the shifts in narratives and public attitudes, along with the growing youth solidarity, significant? Are we beginning to see a crack in foreign policies towards Palestine and Israel and vis-a-vis the two-state solution? Especially now seeing the presence of progressive representatives in US Congress, and maybe a slight change in language by the Biden administration, which came after a long silence on the recent events. And finally, what are the prospects for real change to effectively address Israel's ongoing occupation and discriminatory policies. To answer these questions, we are very fortunate to have three excellent analysts who have taken the time to be with us today and share their insights. I will briefly introduce them in alphabetical order. Mariam Barghouti is a Palestinian American writer and researcher. Diana Butto is a lawyer, a human rights lawyer and analyst, and she's a former legal advisor to the PLO and the Palestinian negotiations. Amjad Iraqi is the editor and writer at 972 magazine, or plus 972 magazine. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and I look forward to your contributions. Again, just a reminder for those of you who saw the lineup of speakers, Salim Barahmeh is unfortunately not feeling well and was not able to join us. Before we start the discussion, allow me to just remind everyone about the questions. You can send in your questions anytime during the discussion. You can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to send in your questions, or if you are watching on our website, please send your questions by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. That is, again, events@arabcenterdc.org. Please identify yourself and your affiliation if possible, and indicate to whom your question is addressed. We will try to take as many questions as possible. The format for today will be 2 rounds of questions for the panelists, which will take up the first hour. Then we'll spend the first 30 minutes taking your questions and answering questions from the online audience. And with that, let's, without further ado, let's start the discussion. Round 1 will focus on the assessment of the recent wave of unified Palestinian youth activism. And I would like to start with Diana. Diana, in your assessment, what is the state of Palestinian youth and activism today? And what factors led to this energized and unified mobilization in 2021 in particular? Is this different? How is this different than what we've seen before? And maybe just to build on that, what is your assessment of the current state of the Palestinian leadership vis-a-vis this youth movement? Is this a new era in Palestinian politics, or just a phase? Diana?
Thank you very much, Tamara. Thanks for including me in this wonderful panel. I also want to thank my co-panelists, Amjad and Mariam, for being so outstanding and really carrying the flag during this period. It's been so heartening to see all of us working together as we always have. And I'm very proud to be able to share a stage with them today. Tamara, in order to answer your question, I think we have to step back a little bit. I think there always has been youth engagement and mobilization throughout history in Palestine. And I think that this mobilization is not just in one area, but it has crossed all of these fictitious lines that Israel has created for us. Because as we know, Israeli racism and discrimination and apartheid don't stop at the green line. They obviously spill over into all of the different parts of Palestine. I think what made this different, however, if we can say that it is different, is that it ended up spreading a little bit more. So in the past, and I can just give you some examples, in the past, in 2018, when the US illegally moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there were protests that happened in Jerusalem. There were protests that happened in Haifa, and you'll recall there were protests obviously that were happening in Gaza, because that was the time when Israel used the opportunity to gun down more than 60 Palestinians on that very day. And so we saw that these protests were happening across the board. They were also happening in the West Bank. The reason I mention this is because I happened to be in the protest in Jerusalem on the day that the embassy move took place, and we saw this inauguration, this totally tone deaf inauguration, and then the following evening and the next day in Haifa, and those protests were massive, and they were protests that were not only massive, but they were organized not by the traditional political parties, but by the youth movements, by Jarrah, by others as well. So we've always seen this type of mobilization because, as I said, Palestinians understand that Israeli racism, apartheid, discrimination, ethnic cleansing, it doesn't just stop at the green line, that extends over. And so that's always been a common feature of the way that we have seen protests take shape. In fact, there isn't one action that Israel commits that in one part of Palestine that doesn't have a reverberation in another part of Palestine. Whether it's annexation, you feel it you see protests happening inside 48, or the attacks on Gaza, again, you see them in 48 and in the West Bank. Or even the Prover plan, the plan that was attempting to ethnically cleanse the Nakab, you again saw that there were protests that were taking place both in the West Bank, including Jerusalem, obviously, and as well in Gaza. What made things different this time was the fact that the Israelis touched Jerusalem. And what I mean by touching Jerusalem is that they did everything that they could possibly do to try to prevent Palestinians from being able to worship in Jerusalem during the holiest month of the Islamic calendar. And then not only that, but then made sure that they prevented Palestinians from worshiping during the holiest day of the holiest month of the Islamic calendar. And it was that ended up mobilizing people from across, getting even bigger protests than we had before. I really hope that this momentum continues. My fear, however, is that the same structures that existed at the end of April are the same structures that exist today at the end of May, beginning of June. And that's where I would really love to see that there is something new and something different, and that youth who have been always at the forefront of these protests, that they begin to see that they have the ability to take a leadership role and not just sit back and wait. In terms of the Palestinian Authority, look, the Palestinian Authority did everything possible to try to crush this until it was no longer crushable. And I'm sure Maryam can speak to this better than I can, because she's the person who's based in the West Bank. She's based in Ramallah. But one thing that was very clear was that they tried to co-opt these protests. The first part, as you mentioned, when the Israelis had put in these barricades in Jerusalem, preventing people from getting to Al-Aqsa, the Palestinian Authority tried to co-opt this and say that it was because of their great measures that we saw that the gates were removed, these barricades were removed. Obviously, that wasn't true. Then we saw a second phase where they tried to actually stop protests from happening, and that was earlier on, particularly as we began to see a response from Gaza. And then the third phase of it was once again to go and simultaneously co-opt and then try to crush these protests. And where we sit right now is we're on the crushing phase. They're using this opportunity, this going back where people are just catching their breaths now to carry out mass arrests, just as the Israelis are carrying out mass arrests as well.
Thank you, Diana, for putting all of this in perspective. My next question is for Amjad. And just going back a little bit, in your opinion or assessment, what led to this unified youth activism or mobilization this time around in 2021? And looking at Palestinian citizens in Israel in particular, is this an unprecedented level of mass mobilization and participation, as we've seen in protests, marches, and the strike and boycotts and so on? What is the underlying, if you will, what are the underlying conditions that brought us to this moment?
Thank you, Tamara, and the Arab Center, and also real pleasure to be with Diana and Maryam. Always wonderful to be in conversation with you two. I want to echo, first of all, everything that Diana said. I might dig further, add some more details to the pieces that she excellently laid out. The first thing to emphasize is the extent to which Jerusalem really played the central role in reviving and reawakening this activism. This is what I think has made this feel different. The activism that we're seeing is not unprecedented per se. Again, like the past decade saw many of these flashes and episodes. The Second Intifada was, I think, the most recent sort of series of events that was almost relative to this scale. And on all the decades before that, these moments have happened. But what has really led to this is, at least especially from the eyes of Palestinian citizens in 48, the fact that Jerusalem was now taking a central role in this reawakening was absolutely fundamental. As Diana was explaining, the fact that you had these two kind of parallel localized struggles. One was in Sheikh Jarrah, which was really being amplified, in the struggle against the forcible expulsions in the neighborhood. And at the same time as that was happening, you also had the Al-Aqsa compound, Damascus Gate, the Israeli police repression and restrictions were imposed there. And so, what seemed like these fragmented pieces actually were interconnecting. And suddenly the Jerusalemite neighborhoods, which Israel has done as much as it could to try to keep fragmenting, to separate it as much as possible, we're now we're reorganizing, we're reconnecting, we're restoring almost like the Palestinian unity within Jerusalem, in spite of all the repression. So seeing that and witnessing that, it was sort of like seeing the heartbeat of Palestine coming back to life in a way that has been brutally suppressed for many, many years. And that gave the lifeblood to Palestinian communities on both sides of the Green Line and in diaspora. Like this is the best metaphor I can come up with to really see how much that Palestinian political and social body has really come back to the fore. To go a little deeper, especially in the perspective of Palestinian citizens, you sometimes have these periods of sort of dormancy in our political activism. It's hard to keep up the kind of protests that you've seen in these past few weeks, but that never means that resistance in any way is dying down. You have everything from political activism through the leadership, you have grassroots outreach and organizing on the streets. And this is also in the face of numerous laws and policies that try to restrict that try to suppress that in many ways. But what really clicked, I think, with a lot of young Palestinian citizens in this generation is that, since the 1990s, a lot of young Palestinians in their 20s and 30s, they were promised this idea of equality. They were promised this idea that, there'll be some form of Palestinian liberation. There'll be some kind of solution. This was the idea that we were sold in the Oslo era. And as time went by, we saw the extent to which this was a myth. We saw the extent to which it wasn't that we were even heading towards like a better future. In fact, the oppression was getting worse. This is not just, for example, that Gaza became under the severe blockade. The apartheid rule from the river to the sea continued to be entrenched. Settlements continued to expand, but also inside 48, the Israeli Knesset and the Israeli government were passing more explicitly racist discriminatory laws to entrench our inequality. And the epitome of that was the Jewish state law back in 2018, which is not hardly the first racist law in Israel, but it was sort of the culmination of what Israel achieved. So as time went by, that vision, that idea we were sold was completely erased. And just in the past year alone, the extent to which you've had the normalization between Israel and Arab states, you've had the effects of the Trump plan being put out in practice, the entrenchment of Israeli apartheid, and the complete failure of the Palestinian leadership, culminating in the failure of even Palestinian Authority elections, with all the problems that it would have, that it suffered from. But the fact that even that couldn't go through, all that combines to remind Palestinians, including 48, that we're very much on our own, and that we needed to take the helm of the struggle back into our hands. That we spent the last 2-3 decades trying to look for as much help and support as possible, which is needed in the end. That solidarity is required, international action is required. But what we really saw extraordinarily in these past few weeks is the extent to which Palestinians have come out to the streets, and especially these young Palestinians who everyone thought would sort of forget their identity, would not be so demanding, would sort of get sucked into the sort of socioeconomic lifestyle that that's better than our previous generations. But the young Palestinians came out and said, absolutely not. And so that revival of that pulse was really crucial. And this is not only in terms of the identity that's awakening, but also the extent to which we could see the one-state reality that we were all living under. At the same time that Israeli fighter jets were bombarding Gaza, you had the Israeli army also firing live bullets at protesters in the West Bank. And at the same time, you had Israeli police brutally repressing Palestinian protests inside Israel, invading people's homes, conducting these mass arrests, which are still continuing to this day. even had these kind of lynch mobs, like you're mentioning, Tamara, actively going out to assault and harass and destroy the properties of Palestinian citizens, and the police would either stand idly by or join these mobs in those assaults. And so in seeing that sort of synchronized violence, regardless if you had citizenship, regardless of which side of the Green Line you're on, was this very clear reminder to Palestinian youth who already know the kind of regime that they're in, but to see the extent to which they will never be welcomed here. They can never achieve equality. They might be able to get certain rights here and there, but in the end, the Israeli regime is there to tell them, get back into your cages. And this was a message that Palestinian citizens got. So I'll kind of pause here. Well, actually, sorry, just one more thing to add, I suppose. And the extent to which this was really been channeled was very evident in the general strike that happened last month. Usually when general strikes are inside 48, they're often, in the past few years, they've hardly been followed. They're always almost exclusively inside Israel. They're kind of these non-events that are called for by the traditional leadership. The fact that young activists took the date that was announced for the strike and said, we want to strike all across historic Palestine, and it was almost overwhelmingly followed, shows the extent of that power and demonstrated to Palestinian citizens and Palestinians across the world that you can reclaim that power. You don't need to rely on your leadership. You don't need to rely on the international community. We can take that into ourselves. I'm sure we'll speak about this more, but I'll pause there for now.
Thank you, Amjad. And as you mentioned, this synchronized violence was a reminder for all Palestinians of the shared struggle that they're facing. And now I would like to move to Maryam and maybe build on that a little bit and focus on Palestinian youth in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Maryam, what is the role of young Palestinians in the social and political atmosphere under the repressive measures of the Palestinian Authority, as Diana mentioned? And has this absence of the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem played a role in the recent wave of mobilization? And if you could also touch a little bit on the role of Palestinian youth in the international context through connecting, sharing on social media, and speaking to the mainstream media. Are they changing the perceptions and playing a role in this shift that we're seeing internationally? Can you please turn on your microphone, Maryam? Sorry.
Oh, see. But thank you, Tamara. And I want to reaffirm my thanks also to be on this panel. And I want to remind that a lot of us are being grateful that we're all sharing spaces because we are divided. So the fact that we are centering Palestinian voices from everywhere is both humbling and a reflection, I think, of the successes that we've seen recently. And I really appreciate these questions because they recontextualize what's happening. So I've been trying to move away from this concept of the leadership, the questions on leadership, right? I look at them more as representatives, and right now Palestinians are saying, well, they don't actually represent us. So we're moving forward in that direction. I think that's the change, is that oftentimes we may look at leadership as, symbols that cannot be touched, but we're saying, no, in the end, you're representatives. And in terms of the absence of the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem, I don't know if that really has a role to play in kind of the political representation of Palestinians as much as it does in, for Palestinians, they're completely abandoned in Jerusalem. They have no protection and they are protecting each other. And that's also the rise in community. What we are seeing is a rise and a coming together in community. And of course, so I don't think youth are taking a very visible role as a signifier of our strength or a signifier of our fearlessness. It's because we constitute the majority of the population. 22% of Palestinians are between 18 and 29, and 45% are under the age of 18. So you have around 67% of our population, and I'm only counting the West Bank and Gaza because we don't even have the right to carry a census for Palestinians with Israeli citizenship and in diaspora, which we have limited access to. But 67% of those here are under the age of 29. And that on its own has been, a force to be reckoned with, because this is the age group where we envision things, where we don't look at, the offered solutions as the only option, right? We're recreating options, we're imagining. And I think there's a misconception, especially for youth, in terms of taking, the role in the political process, right? I think it's an informal role, but it is more impactful than the formal frameworks that we've often seen being worked under. I mean, the United Nations was created, 1949, in tandem with the creation of the State of Israel. So it shows you how these frameworks are very abstract, and youth are daring to move towards concrete realities, because these past 73 years weren't only just the colonization that we're experiencing. We've spent them imagining together. And right now, what we're trying to do is bring that imagination to the forefront. One of the strongest things in terms of the media discourse change, and this is my personal opinion in it, is that we're the change isn't happening now, right? We often think change is a moment. We're a reflection of the changes that already happened. And right now there are changes happening that will only be reflected towards, the future, which is why Palestinians say, keep the momentum up. Do not lose heart and have nafas twil, make sure that in Arabic, we say nafas twil, meaning it's going to be a long process. You need to take our time. We don't want to burn out. In the end, we are people with families, with lives that are coming together. But more than this, half of the Palestinian diaspora doesn't have access to Palestine, but at the same time, they've transcended the boundaries of land and territory and brought back the question to what it is. This is what colonialism is. This is what ethnic cleansing is. It does not have to be an Israeli soldier shooting us or quote unquote neutralizing us, as the Israeli military often says. It is killing our identity. It is killing our ability to relate to one another. For the first time, I'm hearing Palestinian youth share experiences from Lid to Haifa to the refugee camps in Lebanon to American citizens who are Palestinian that were put on things like the Canary Mission in the US so that they can be banned entry to their home, so that they can be denied jobs. So Israel's attack and attempt to ethnically cleanse is not limited to the ways or the boundaries that we're here in Palestine. And I think that's also helped push us forward. But more than this, let's move beyond exceptionalizing us and exceptionalizing Palestine. There is a tangible shift happening, I think. And a lot of us are hesitant to see it or admit it because we just don't want to bring our hopes back up again because we've been betrayed so much. But the world has been up and rising and protesting and rebelling against many of the different oppressive forces around us. And this is why I think we have seen more solidarity in the international community. It is not just about Palestine. It is about this system, and it is a labyrinthine system that tries to silence us. And then in terms of the coverage, especially mainstream media, and I think the confrontation that we are seeing right now from Palestinians, the questions have become predictable. It is the same exact question where we all become spokespeople for either Hamas or spokespeople against the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. And we're trying to bring it to more simpler terms to showcase that in the end, what is being fought is a settler colonialism. And that's what we're speaking out against. We found the language. We found the voice because we shared each other's experiences and other struggles. Israel capitalized a lot on our inability to reach out to the international community. It didn't happen just with a siege that is 15 years long on Gaza, or the fact that our borders here, my exit and entry from Palestine is controlled by Israel, or even Palestinians with Israeli citizenship who are humiliated at the airport. They are racially profiled. And if a soldier decides not to let them leave or enter, they have the right. So it's showing how all of this targeted attacks also allowed us to create a new language. One, which we refuse to compromise on, because the moment we start compromising on that is where we falter into the political discourse where the Oslo Accords happen. And the younger generation, we are the generation that was born under Oslo. So all we've known is, okay, well, this framework clearly doesn't work. You know, I've spent 25 years of my life under it. It's time for change. And that's what we're doing. The first step is, let's stop downplaying it. We're really not gonna stay quiet anymore because our lives depend on it. As Sheikh Jarrah is happening, so is Silwan. As Silwan is happening, so is Walaja and Beit Lahem. So are the areas around the West Bank in Area C. And settlers have become so emboldened that they'll just come out with their gun and shoot at you. Complete impunity here, and complete impunity abroad. When right now there's a criminalization happening, and I'm so sorry I'm taking so long, but criminalization happening with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. This is a non-violent movement, and then at the same time, people are asking me about Hamas, but you're literally criminalizing the voices that are trying to say, I don't want to be complicit in settler colonialism. What we're doing is, we're so much more basic than the politicians and the diplomats and a lot of the jargon that kind of confuses public spaces. And we're saying, no, it's a lot simpler than that. And we really can't afford the luxury of even entertaining it right now. I think that's the difference. That's what's happening. I'm so sorry I took so long. We're also not used to having so much space to express ourselves. I think we're all getting used to it. And Amjad and Diana, I agree to this, I suppose.
Always thrilled to hear from you, Mariam.
And space without hostility. This is the the other part of it.
Right. Well, thank you, Mariam. And I appreciate this hopeful, albeit a little cautious tone. But speaking of, this international solidarity and finding the voice and creating new language, and seeing a vision outside of the current status quo, I want to move to the next round of questions and focus on the prospects of change. Whether the Palestinian youth in today's political climate can be involved or lead about the Palestinian national movement and in confronting the ongoing Israeli occupation and discriminatory policies, but also the complicity of the international community and US support. I'd like to start with Amjad. So are we seeing a transformative moment in Palestinian politics today? What follows this momentum? And looking at the big picture of the Palestinian struggle, how significant is this unified mass activism for the struggle for rights and freedoms for all Palestinians?
Yeah, and honestly, it's very early to tell. This energization of the movement is literally only a few weeks old. And to be frank, there's nothing inevitable about where this movement will head, or its victory might be short-lived, it might be very long-lived. It depends on the repression that's being targeted against us. It depends on the continued mobilization. The good news, I think, is that this is understood by the Palestinians who went out to the streets, and the Palestinians who are really leading this. Even though, especially in the 2 weeks of the intense, the most intense 2 weeks, but especially when Gaza was being bombarded and the people going out to the streets, although that has, quote unquote, calmed down, you're still having many policies and repression still carrying on, but the Palestinian activists themselves are still in conversation and still continue to talk about what do we do next. There's a very clear understanding that the protests could never be enough and they can't be enough. But this is why, for example, you had the general strike that was announced to say that and it's not just about shutting down your doors of the shops, but that we're having cultural activities, we're having know your rights workshops, we're getting in touch with Palestinians across the Green Line, and we're asking allies abroad to be a part of it. That strike was a huge success. And so it's like, okay, so what happens next? And so now, for example, there's now a campaign encouraging Palestinians to buy Palestinian products and not to buy just like Israeli products, everything from milk cartons to even going to Israeli malls, depending on whether you're on this side of the Green Line, even if you're in the West Bank, if you're using Israeli products, go buy from your local Palestinian farmer, buy milk that's produced by a Palestinian store, and so on and so forth. It's the idea of like, let's get a taste of what self-sufficiency and economic empowerment is like. And this is incredible to see. And again, it's not the first time these sort of things have happened, but it's like, how do we keep up this momentum? We're not asking everyone to keep showing up and fighting the police on the streets, but like, how can we do this in very creative ways? So this is extraordinary to see. And it's important that, while there is this amazing proactive activism, the repression is still ongoing. Again, we were just mentioning the fact that inside 48, the Israeli police are still arresting Palestinian citizens who took part in these demonstrations. I can almost guarantee that members of the Knesset right now, especially this new government that's now been signed on last night, that many of them are going to be considering what kind of legislation can we pass in order to make it harder for Palestinian citizens to come out to the streets the next time this happens. What other emergency or security powers can we grant the police to essentially become a more militarized version of state repression, to kind of almost make them mimic even more the Israeli army and authoritarian powers that they operate in the West Bank and Gaza. Because we've seen this before. Every time there is that resistance, there's a massive Israeli state pushback. And so it's very difficult to know what's going to happen. And like I said, there's no guarantee, but I think that is offering a lot of kind of energy and mobilization. And the fact that these conversations are happening not just among the youth, but even the older generations, who didn't have the kind of resources that the young people have now. And we talked about social media, for example. Social media is not only allowing Palestinians to connect with each other, but to kind of articulate their cause to people abroad. And this goes for even like media outlets and policymakers, whereby in the past you used to sort of take like the Israeli army's press statement about, oh, this is what happened in Gaza, or this is what's been going on in the streets of Haifa. But on social media, you're seeing Palestinians, put up their own testimonies, their own photographs, their own videos of what's been going on, the bombardments, the assaults, and so on and so forth. So they're immediately countering the sort of state narrative that everything is fine, or that we're controlling the situation and it's the Palestinians who are causing the problems. So we're providing the truth in that narrative. And this, I think, is really this is really crucial for the international community. Like I said, international journalists, I think, in ways that I haven't seen in quite a long time or in several years, there really was a proactive effort, for example, to get Palestinians on the record, to get their voices to be out there. And this is crucial for the public discourse, but it's also crucial for policymakers and politicians, that the more that Palestinians are being able to speak and assert themselves through every means necessary, it's also putting policymakers into a corner. Many of them, especially in the United States and Europe, will still try to find their way to keep providing that support to Israel. As we saw, even Congress now is like literally thinking of more ways to give more arms and more military funding to the state. But this pressure is building. You can feel it. And again, this will be faced with backlash, but I think that's been a very, very positive, trend to see. And insofar as the unity, it's one thing for the Palestinian political leadership, the traditional leaders who are clearly not interested in proper unity, but because we're seeing that grassroots unity, I think that, coming back to what Mariam was saying, like that's a different idea of leadership. That's a different idea of organizing politics. And in many ways, what's been the movement of these past few weeks is as much in defiance of their traditional leaders as it is against the Israeli state and its colonial regime. So I think this is, if there's any hope in that unity, if there's any hope in that, it's understanding to kind of decentralize that power and to mobilize it, in every town, in every neighborhood, on every Twitter page, and so on and so forth. And time will tell if that will, if that can continue to build up to something even more sustainable.
Thank you, Amjad. And just speaking of this power in the decentralization of these movements, I want to go back to Maryam a little bit. And we've heard a lot of questions about, is there going to be a new young leadership emerging from this? What's happening to young people in different parts of Palestinian communities who are fed up and have been becoming more and more active? Do we need leadership? As Amjad said, maybe this decentralization is an opportunity rather than a shortcoming. And if you could touch a little bit on young people in Gaza. I think we tried to get someone on this panel from Gaza, but we weren't able to this time. So I think it would be important to bring some of that perspective as well.
Thank you, Amjad, for all the points really that you made, and Tamara for building on that. So in terms of leadership, we really have to also kind of humble this idea of leadership. I think leadership is rising in different areas in Palestine. So you see, people taking lead in the legal sector, people taking lead in the different areas. But what is really leading us, our leadership, is our goal. And our goal right now is to be free and to be able to say, I want to be free without being punished for it. And that's, I think, what's happening. It is rising. Now, in terms of representatives who will kind of represent Palestinians as a people, let us bring the people back first, right? Before that happens, because I do genuinely believe that circumstance will impose itself and leadership will rise with it. Let's also not impose on Palestinians, especially what I've seen from those who have been very vocal and have, political backgrounds. There's this imposition that they become leaders too, but none of us are really in this to be something or do something. We're really in this to live, and to live on our lands. So it's really important to humble that. And Amjad, I also think, touched on something very important, that there is kind of this reframing of politics. There's also this reframing of governance and representation in a way that brings it back to the population itself, right? And right now, what we've seen, especially with the calls on censorship of Palestinians and Palestinian content, is how it's so important to just keep things visible right now, to be able to see where things are rising and where they're not, especially as a confrontation of this isolation tactic that Israel uses on a physical boundary level, but the international community is using by not letting people have their right to access information. And I genuinely believe people are smart enough to know what's happening on their own if they have access to the information. And this is especially because we've all kind of became civilian journalists right now. And keep in mind, this is happening after a pandemic where there was difficulty for many international journalists to come, which required that we reclaim our voice. And it required them that if they wanted to cover Palestine, well, they needed access here. And that happened through us. So I also think the timing is important. In terms of Gaza and bringing that voice in, yeah, let's start talking about Gaza as part of Palestine, not a sovereign state that is at war with another state, Israel. No, these are 5 Palestinian governorates that have been under siege for 15 years. Let us say they're 5 Palestinian governorates. If Gaza scares everyone so much because everyone's associating it with Hamas, and that was the success of the Israeli narrative. It overshadowed all of it. In terms of international solidarity, keep Palestinians safe. Stop funding our bullets and our bombing and US military aid. That is mostly military aid. $3.8 billion let's invest that maybe in not having American police shoot down Black youth in the US. Let's invest that in education. I know the students in the US are under complete debt. Maybe put it there because it's killing us. And it also helped fund a nuclear plant for Israel. So it's not just a risk on us. This is really a regional risk and attack on humanity in general. We've seen what nuclear powers do. And right now, the emboldenment of the settler movement and Naftali Bennett becoming, prime minister, who's very blatant about shoot to kill. The Arabs, I'm sorry, can't even say Palestinian. And stop, the funding, call for sanctions. And right now we are seeing it happen not at the policy level, but by the imposition for policymakers here. It happened by trade unionists refusing to send arms to Palestine to be used against us. We see it in students speaking out and being kicked out of university from places like the UK and the US that pride themselves in democracy. So let's keep us safe. And by us, I don't just mean me or Amjad or Ghana or Palestinians here. Keep us safe because I see the attacks that are happening on journalists that want to cover this right. I see the attacks happening on activists that are saying, I have the right to boycott. I am seeing the attacks on students and teenagers and kids being called terrorists because they can say Palestine, because they're braver than a lot of people I have seen speak on Palestine. And I think that's really important in bringing, with the question of should we bring others to the conversation? Yes, amplify each other. This was one of the successes that we've had. We're all amplifying each other. Across the spectrum in different spheres, we're also not confining ourselves to one mechanism of resistance, and we're legitimizing our right to resist. As any group that has been oppressed will tell you, if there is someone pointing a gun at you and you want to live, you're going to fight to live, right? And that's really what's happening. So support one another. If there's an employer kicking someone out for speaking about Palestine, come together and find them another job or speak with that employer. If it's basic, the community support Amjad was talking about, that's why we're still here. It reminds me a lot of the stories I heard of the first Intifada, but right now we're hoping it doesn't get hijacked. So that's what we're telling everyone around the world, is come together with any different way, but let's keep us safe.
Thank you, Mariam. And I want to pick up on your point about U.S. military aid and, the propositions of sanctions. And I want to move to Diana. What is the role of the international community in the current state of affairs, and especially after years of cuddling the Israeli, former maybe Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Is there a substantial change in foreign policies or in representatives rather than administrations? Is there a change in the Biden administration's rhetoric regarding Palestine and Israel that can be considered hopeful? And how significant are the voices of the progressive members of US Congress? We know that the first Palestinian American woman, Rashida Tlaib, is in Congress, and she's played an important role here, but many others who have supported, some introduced legislation in support of Palestinian rights. Is this ultimately, does this have the potential for pushing for sanctions or change on the ground?
Thank you very much, Tamara. It's a very good question. Look, I think it's important for us to distinguish between the international diplomatic community and the international community, meaning you, me, and everybody else. The international diplomatic community is still saying the same things that they've been saying before, like the same stuff they were saying in April is the same stuff they're saying in May, and the same stuff that they're saying now in June. And the reason is because they are so far behind the times when it comes to where the world is, when it comes to all of these issues. So, for example, it may have been okay for them back in 2014 to condemn Palestinians for their own deaths. They're using that same approach today, whereas the rest of the world has opened up its eyes and seen that this isn't a question of Palestinians being blamed for their own deaths, but there is an actual actor being Israel, and that it's not just the actor Israel, but that actor is being emboldened by the United States, it's being emboldened by Europe, it's being emboldened by Canada, it's being emboldened by certain countries in Latin America, and so on. And so I don't think that we've seen a substantial shift yet on the part of the international diplomatic community, but I do think that that shift is going to come, because if you think back to the period of apartheid in South Africa, when we saw that the big push came not from the international diplomatic community, but came from civil society, came from the push that was happening on the part of the ANC, et cetera, that we ended up seeing that the change happened by international donors or international actors, international countries, international representatives at a later stage. In other words, it was the people that were leading and the leaders that were following. And I think the same thing is happening when it comes to Palestine. I fully expect that, in fact, we've already seen it, that they are going to go back to business as usual, trying to prop up an illegitimate president named Mahmoud Abbas, trying to push forward reconstruction through him to try to give him some semblance of legitimacy, even though he's no longer legitimate. And they're going to continue to use the same talking points that they used in the 90s, in the year 2000, and use it in the 2010s and in 2020 and so on. In fact, I sometimes joke that you can copy paste a statement from the late 90s and just change the date to today's date, and you'll see substantially the same wording with just a few little changes here and there. This is definitely the case when it comes to Silwan, which we've been seeing the ethnic cleansing take place there since the 90s, and the same language is continually used. When it comes to the coddling, this part is also very important. I don't think that we're going to see an end to the coddling now that Netanyahu is potentially out. And the reason is that so many people are viewing this with a sigh of relief. I'm not, just to be clear for the record, I'm not viewing Netanyahu's departure with a sigh of relief because Naftali Bennett is just as bad, if not worse. This is not a question of the person, it's a question of the structures. But for many within the international community, they're viewing it simply in terms of the person. And the potential departure of Netanyahu is going to be greeted with a red carpet for the Bennetts, for the Lapids, for the other people who come along who share the exact same vision, if not worse, than Netanyahu shares. So I suspect that those years of coddling are going to continue. And in fact, it's of little surprise to me that we're now seeing the request for $1 billion by Congress to Congress on the part to replenish Iron Dome. It's a little surprise to me that we saw that $735 million aid package to go through Israel. None of this is at all surprising, because we're now going to be entering a new phase of coddling, where it's not just coddling Israel, but it's coddling the replacement to Netanyahu. In terms of Biden, have I seen a substantial change in language? No. There were some changes in language, and I think that I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there were some changes in language. Was it substantial? No. And I think that we don't have to have such a low ceiling any longer, where we're looking and saying, he said both Palestinians and Israelis need to be living in security. So what? If that's where the ceiling is, I think we need to be pushing it further. Of course, I'm always told that what happens behind the scenes is so different from what happens in front of the camera, and so on and so forth. But I cannot discount the fact that the United States blocked 4 UN Security Council resolutions when they didn't need to block those 4 UN Security Council resolutions. And lastly, when it comes to progressive members of Congress, it's wonderful to see, and I'm delighted that there are so many people who are pushing within the United States to change those policies and to change party politics. I want to continue to see that. I don't think that we should overinflate it, nor do I think we should discount it in any way. All I want to say is that I'm delighted to see that these voices are coming through, and that it's not just coming through, by the way, when it comes to those specific voices that we had expected to hear from, but it's also through other people whose eyes are now open and who are beginning to make the connections between what it is that Israel is doing and what the United States has been promoting globally as well.
Thank you, Diana, for this dose of reality. We do have a lot of questions coming in, and it's time for the audience's questions, which we'll spend the next 30 minutes or so addressing. What I'm going to do is maybe present 3 questions at a time and give all of you a chance to respond, just so we can take as many questions as possible. The first question is from journalist Natalie Glazo. She's asking, is there any hope of coordinating youth in exile and in occupied Palestine to decide to form a political party? So that's kind of touching on the leadership questions that we've addressed a little bit, but also to have a voice in the Palestinian parliament or the Knesset. And also she's asking about what's taking the Arab List Party and participating in the new government. What can we expect from the Lapid-Bennett Bureau? The next question from Kristen Roerig is asking, she's an international policy fellow at the Presbyterian Church USA, and she's asking Amjad and anyone else how the framing of journalism and media has changed in light of the recent events. Are American international journalists using different language? And I think Amjad touched on this a little bit, if you would like to expand. Next question from Nancy Butto, and she's asking, when will the Palestinian Authority recognize the work of young Palestinians and call for elections? So that's again a question of leadership. And another question I'd like to just throw in, a question from Lori King, a member of our academic advisory board. She's asking, how can we keep the ball bouncing in the US, particularly working with people in Congress? And a related question from Stephen Longden. What is the most effective activities for those in Europe and the US that they can undertake to support Palestinians in the short and medium term? Okay, so that's a lot of questions. Maybe we can start with Amjad, and then we move to the next.
Sure. I'll kick off with the question about how framing has changed in international media. I think we touched on this, and Mariam, I think, also articulated this in how much the past few weeks, to kind of repackage what you're saying, there is a sense that there's been almost like a kind of unshackling among many Palestinians about the language and the discourse that they're using. Words like settler colonialism and apartheid, of course, these are not new. They've been around for a very long time. They've been diagnosed, from grassroots activists to NGO reports to intellectuals to political leaderships. And to see Palestinians, take to Twitter to Facebook to Instagram and use it unabashedly, and to say, all these kind of represent different kinds of elements of oppression, but they're all part of the same ideology, the same regime. We can't, think of, and even among Palestinians, where we sometimes internalize our fragmentation, sometimes there was this reassertion of like, we can't do that anymore. We have to get back onto that common pulse. And so there's this kind of proactive effort by Palestinians to ensure that khalas, we're using settler colonialism, we're using apartheid, and we'll do everything we need to get that on the public discourse, in one way or another. at the same time that you have this this unshackling happening, and this complete letting go of inhibitions on this language, actually international media, at least in a lot of outlets I saw, were actually receptive to this. To see settler colonialism in I think the Washington Post article that Mariam wrote with Noura a few weeks ago was like, wow, I'm not sure if it was the first or last, if it was the first time per se, but it was just extraordinary that in that moment, yes, this is a language that we're using. And that article was precisely about that. We're not, we're not playing this old ball game anymore. And also my colleague at 972 Magazine, Henriette Shakov, she's spoken on the podcast where she phrased it sort of like these words actually are making it past the editors' desks. That even editors and journalists themselves who are reviewing these op-eds that are coming in are like, yes, apartheid, yes, settler colonialism. So there is this kind of dialectic that's suddenly happening that I think really catapulted this discourse and these diagnoses in a way that hasn't, that took a lot of organizing for years. It took a lot of attempts by Palestinians to break those barriers set by international media outlets. First being shamed or being forced to self-censor, to be concerned about the kind of backlash. And it's not to say, and in the end, words do matter. And these are debates that Palestinians are debating first and foremost on how to articulate them. How do they align with each other? Where sometimes some of the problems with using settler colonialism and apartheid for ourselves, or even how to articulate. But these are live debates that are all happening and they're all legitimate. But just to have that out there in the international level is absolutely extraordinary. And I think we really saw that shift. I was worried that I was only getting this in my bubbles, but to see, I did see, or at least I got the sense, and maybe my colleagues agree, there were way more Palestinians writing, being even allowed to write op-eds in mainstream outlets. Journalists were reaching out to Palestinians, in much greater numbers than I remember, at least amongst a lot of colleagues and activists that I've seen. And I think a huge part of this is credit to many, to the years of organizing that's been done and to the use of social media, but also I think I want to credit, I think last year, especially among American outlets, the Black Lives Movement and the re-energization of it last year after the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I think really forced a lot of conversations among US outlets about how do we narrate the Black struggle? Are we prioritizing Black voices to articulate that struggle? What assumptions and how are we contributing to a discourse that actually empowers power dynamics rather than challenges them? And this connects to what Mariam was saying about, in the end, this is beyond Palestine. This is a struggle and a conversation that's happening across many, different countries and different societies all across the world. And so to know that, at least insofar as the US media outlets, that conversation happened last year, where we could see the kind of ramifications of that conversation happening in Palestine, even if it was just for a few weeks, and even now journalists are sort of dying down in their reporting of Palestine, but it was extraordinary to see. So I do think that framing and that shift is huge, it's fundamental. And now the question is coming down to, and I think this was kind of late to one of the questions that was asked about how do you keep the ball bouncing and how to keep it rolling, is to keep up that momentum. That don't just come to talk about Palestine whenever there is a bombardment of Gaza. It's crucial and important, and we understand that, it's one of the more intense times where this does happen, but what's happening the day after? What is blockade doing to the Palestinians in Gaza right now? What about the people who are injured, maimed, who lost their houses? And this is just in Gaza alone. Think also in the West Bank, what's happening now inside 48, where Palestinian citizens are still getting arrested. There's always a day after, and it's not the kind of the hot violence of of bombs and bullets, etc. But there's still this slow, cold violence that's still operating every single day, and that's where the attention needs to be. And that's the most important part, because part of what allows Israeli colonialism or Israeli apartheid to continue is this using of this slow violence, of this quiet, quote unquote, violence. To today, everything's fine, everything's calm, everything's normal, nothing to see here. You need to keep that lens there. You need to keep that magnifying glass there. And the easiest way to do this in the end is media. Echoing what Diana said, we don't know how politicians and policymakers are going to react in the coming years. And there's obviously this pushback. But as much as we can take the public narrative and the public discourse in our hands and using media to our advantage, from social media to mainstream outlets, that at least is one key avenue to do all that.
Thank you, Amjad. Mariam and Diana, would you like to answer some of those questions in the first round? Mariam?
Yeah, I just want to kind of add in terms of the shifts in media and keeping the ball rolling, especially when it comes to Congress. So there is a shift happening in media, not just on the coverage of Palestine, but journalists reclaiming their right to report on Palestine. Like we saw the way the Associated Press covered the bombing of its own offices in Gaza, as if initially it was reported as if the buildings just got dizzy and collapsed, instead of they got bombed by an Israeli military. And this is about their colleagues, you know? So the pressures that media outlets are facing as well is coming out. So journalists are reclaiming their rights to cover Palestine. We saw the firing, you know, of Emily Wilder, for instance, and the cases just keep coming up. And I'm certain if you speak to any veteran that covered Palestine, that they'll speak to you of the pressures that they face. So there's a shift happening at a more rooted level as well, I think, not just the language that we're using. And in terms of keeping the ball rolling in Congress, I just want to touch on this in that it's crucial to do it. And it does have to do with language as well and simple basics, like why don't we write Palestinians with Israeli citizenship in the official department, like documents? Why is that not written in policy? Why do they keep referring to us as Israeli Arabs? Let's formalize that. Let's formalize that recognition. That's a first step, and I think it's an easy step to do and to take. But it is important to keep it going. If not for Palestinians to just reclaim any legitimacy that, you know, the U.S. has in terms of actually holding pressure on Israel instead of trying to mediate this, like the conflict that we all hear. And the final thing I just want to touch up on was a question about bringing in Palestinians into, you know, parliament. I want to answer the Palestinian parliament section, not Knesset. I don't think, you know, that goes anywhere, as we've seen. But in terms of bringing them as representatives, yes, it's necessary. I think there is hope to do that. In what mechanism that happens, we're yet to tell. And it's also up to us to really decide on that. But yeah, thank you.
Diana?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer the question about the Knesset in terms of what it's probably a whole webinar in and of itself, but I'll answer it very quickly, which is to say, what do I expect to see from Lapid and Bennett? The same, if not worse. And the reason I'm saying this is that even though we have now seen the United Arab List sign on to this coalition backing it, I think they did this because they effectively had to, because it was a losing party. Let me make clear that Mansour Abbas, the person who leads this list, it was not welcome in any of the protests, whether it was in Sheikh Jarrah or in Haifa or in Nazareth or in any of the places. He was specific. There were specific press releases that were sent out saying that he was a person who was not welcome to attend these protests because his position has been one of capitulation. It hasn't been one of standing with the Palestinian community that is inside Israel, that is facing daily discrimination. And so his false attempt at, oh, I'm not sure if I'm going to sign or whatever, it's a bluff. And Lapid and Bennett both know it. And so although he got some quote unquote assurances, I'm pretty sure that those assurances are going to last about as far as Israel is as a democracy, which is they won't last because Israel's not a democracy. And so I think that we're going to see very quickly that he's going to get burned. And instead, there's going to be an attempt. He's going to have a reality check about ask himself whether it's worth it, whether his sole goal was to simply get rid of Netanyahu, which may have been his goal, as well as political survival, or whether he's actually representing the Palestinian community that is inside Israel, that is facing daily apartheid and racism. So I'm not expecting that they're going to do anything positive when it comes to Palestinians. You know, I want to make very clear that when it comes to all of these political parties that are on the center all the way to the right, and including labor, by the way. There is longstanding agreement on one thing, which is how much they want to crush Palestinians. So there are no differences of opinions when it comes to Palestinians. They're all united in this. And so this new coalition was simply a question of removing Netanyahu. It's not a debate about policies or positions or about what or the identity of Israel, or whether Israel believes in whether they want to see equal rights or not equal rights, or end the occupation. These are not debate questions inside Israel. All that is the debate question inside Israel is the question of who is it that's at the helm, and that's it. Even the parties that are considered right-wing are right-wing when it comes to Palestinians. They're not fiscally right-wing. They're not conservative right-wing parties. They're right-wing only when it comes to Palestinians, and also when it comes to centrists. The centrist parties are extremely right-wing when it comes to Palestinians. So I don't expect anything that is going to happen here. As for the question of elections, when will elections in the Palestinian Authority happen? This remains to be seen. I think that what the next move that the international community is going to make is to try to delay these elections as much as possible, to make sure that Abu Mazen is somehow propped up through these reconstruction mechanisms that they're planning on putting together. And so the question of Palestinian elections, the question of Palestinian representation, the question of Palestinian leadership is going to be an indefinite, I predict, an indefinitely put off. Because the international donor community likes it like this. If they didn't, they would have pressured Abu Mazen a long time ago to have elections. We haven't had elections in 15 years. And so it's impossible for them to say they believe in democracy while at the same time propping up a leader who hasn't allowed elections in 15 years.
Thank you, Diana, and all of you. Yeah, again, we have a lot of questions and a lot of long questions. So bear with me here as I try to summarize some of them and see which ones have already been answered. We have a question from our Executive Director at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., Khalil Jahshan. He's asking if you think young Palestinian activists globally who are involved in this Sheikh Jarrah intifada, as he calls it, are they aware of the diagnosis associated with the Arab Spring a decade ago and the inability to translate the new energy and excitement into political gains? Is there a similar danger in Palestine today? We have a couple of questions somewhat related to that, but more about Arab solidarity and Arab youth. Do you think that this is a re-emergence of Arab solidarity with what we've seen, especially in light of the recent normalization deals between Israel and some Arab countries? We had a couple of questions about those. We have some questions about your thoughts on the two-state solution. If you still, think about that, or any really framework, is the one-state solution something that the Palestinian youth are now calling for? That is one other question. Let me see, these have been answered. Bear with me here. Hussein al-Tamimi, I think, he advises a progressive member of Congress on foreign affairs. He's asking, how do you suggest progressive members continue to advance Palestinian advocacy and rights? How can they improve? And so let me pick one last question here. How has transnational solidarity across ethnic and geographical lines played a role in calling for a liberated Palestine? And I think that relates to another question about this solidarity from various social justice movements in the US and around the world. How important are these movements? And we have 10 minutes, so we'll just go for one last round and give you all a chance to respond to any of these questions. Maybe we can start with Amjad again.
Yeah, a lot to choose from. I'll I'll dive into the two-state, one-state question, if only because, and with all respect, I know that's a very common dominant question, but I really hope that in the coming months, in the coming year, however long it takes, that's almost no longer a question. It is. It needs to be very evident around policymakers and public discourse, etc., that any conversation that still thinks a two-state solution is somehow relevant, it needs to be cast away. And the reason is not like it's just some intellectual exercise of whether it's two-state versus one-state, etc. Not a single Israeli is thinking about a two-state solution in the way that the international community is thinking about the two-state solution. Palestinians also cannot see the green line because it doesn't exist on the ground, and it certainly doesn't exist in the pulse of the community. And and the past few weeks, everything that happened in the past months should be the most kind of perfect illustration of why the green line, is only a dotted line on a Google Maps, nothing more. In addition to the fact that Israelis, can easily travel between the river and the sea, across settlements throughout the West Bank. Even I, as a Palestinian citizen, with the few privileges I have with the blue ID card and the yellow license plate, that I can easily travel between here and throughout the West Bank on even settler roads if I wished, and to go see Maryam and Ramallah, for example. It's a very lived reality from the bottom all the way to the top. In addition to the fact that Israel controls everything from the West Bank to Gaza and so on. And again, the thing I was mentioning earlier about the idea of this synchronized violence, is your demonstration that Israel is the sole regime. There is a one-state solution, and it's an apartheid solution. This is what is happening on the ground. Like I said, the fact that the Israeli repressive mechanisms are operating in Gaza, in the West Bank, and inside 48, as well as at the borders, there are Palestinian refugees in exile also trying to come towards the borders, and I think Lebanon, even Jordan, that you could see the single state apparatus operating throughout that line. And again, like we said, the fact that neither Israeli state and the Palestinians themselves, we don't want to be fragmented, and we are not fragmented by those geographic borders. And so the question is not, is a two-state solution still relevant? It's irrelevant. The question is, what kind of one-state solution, if that's the packaging that has to be formed, what is that solution that we're actually looking for? And it's either apartheid or not apartheid. What is, right now there's a big conversation among Palestinians also questioning, the discourse that we've used about what does liberation mean? What does equality mean? And Maryam was describing this exactly, what does it mean to reimagine what a different kind of future is? And this also goes for Palestinian citizens, for example, where for the past, for much of our struggle, we've also kind of had sort of mini fragmentation about trying to strive for equality as equal citizens. It never meant letting go of our Palestinian identity, but it meant trying to maximize our Israeli citizenship as much as possible, whether it was two states or one state, and that was essentially the form of the consensus. But even now, that's being questioned, and especially even in the past few weeks, whereby we saw the extent to which it doesn't matter how much you sort of economically integrate into the Israeli system. It doesn't matter if you have Arab representatives in the Knesset. It doesn't matter that the Joint List had 15 seats, third largest party last year. It doesn't matter, that we are, more educated, that we have more resources at our disposal, that we're doing everything that we thought would grant us equality, and all we're getting is pushback. All we're getting is repression. All we're getting is silencing. All we're being told is get back into your cages. Like the fact that Palestinian citizens, you could end like the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. You could even create like a Palestinian state somehow, which is for sure to be a shriveled Bantustan, a cage in its own right. What does that mean, for example, for Palestinian citizens in the state? Is the state that we're expected to be a part of still this regime that prioritizes supremacy of one ethnic group over another? And in the end, this is the system that operates from the river to the sea. It may have different degrees, but this is the struggle that we're up against, and Palestinians can't accept it. So that's the only conversation, and that needs to be understood by policymakers, by journalists, etc. And I think the day that and again, with respect to our audiences, I think the day that we aren't talking about the two-state solution is the day that we'll know that the conversation is caught up with what everyone believes on the ground. That's Israelis and Palestinians. That's how we understand the reality, for better and for worse. And that's what also needs to be caught up by all internationals and allies abroad.
Thank you, Amjad. And I think we can give Mariam a chance to answer some of the questions. If you want to answer some of the other questions or the same questions, go ahead, Mariam.
I'm going to touch on the question in regarding Arab youth solidarity, especially in light of the normalization. I recall when Bahrain was normalizing, I co-authored a piece with Mariam al-Khawaja on how basically, again, just because the state is trying to normalize for its own political agenda does not mean that the people are normalizing, especially in the Arab world, who have been rising up against dictators and oppressive regimes themselves. So, this is what Diana said in terms of let's separate between the diplomatic sphere and civil society. I do think we need all the solidarity we can get, and I think we are getting it, and it's slightly growing. They are being oppressed, so also speaking out on Palestine right now is a threat to these regimes. The second thing I just want to touch up on is in terms of the Congress advocacy and how to keep pushing that. Just go back to the US itself. The companies that are censoring Palestinians registered in the US, tell them, we can't have that under US policy. The criminalization of BDS, work on decriminalizing it at a county level, at a state level, and at the country level. And then finally, can we start speaking about the settler organizations based in the US that are basically terrorist organizations running out from the US? Maybe we can get Congress to at least push on that instead of criminalizing Palestinians. But I do want to give the space to Diana because I think she's going to touch up on good things right now.
Thank you, Mariam. I could hear you forever, actually. I was going to leave it to you. I want to end by talking about solidarity as well. And I think one of the biggest problems, Tamara, with the Oslo Accords, I mean, there were so many of them, but one of the biggest setbacks when it came to the Oslo Accords was that they really did away with solidarity, with transnational solidarity, because instead of it being a question of solidarity, the impression or the image was that somehow Palestinians can negotiate with Israel, and that in negotiating with Israel, it's just the Israelis and the Palestinians sitting in the room together, completely taking out the power imbalance or ignoring the power imbalance that exists with them. And so one of the things that's been so incredible is the revival of this solidarity, because as Palestinians, it's always been a two-way street. It's never just been this one-way street. There's always been two-way solidarity between prisoners in Palestine and prisoners in the United States and prisoners in Bahrain and so on and so forth. And similarly with liberation movements. So one of the things that has emerged from all of this as the Palestinian Authority is becoming or is irrelevant, and given that the Palestinian Authority should dismantle itself, even though it hasn't yet, is that you see this greater space that's been given to actual solidarity, where we see these movements coming together and recognizing the linkages and recognizing the oppressors, the same oppressors that are providing weapons to Israel to shoot these, those sponge bullets in Al-Aqsa, and they're not sponge, by the way, or to shoot the rubber bullets, which are not rubber, by the way, they're rubber coated metal bullets, are the same companies that are using this equipment in the United States, and the same companies that are using the same equipment in Bahrain, and so on and so forth. And so to see that scope of transnational solidarity revived once again is very heartening, and
for your very insightful and important contributions. I would also like to thank all of the audience who joined us today for tuning in. The video of this discussion will be available on our website later. Thanks to all of you for being part of this program. Please stay in touch and follow our work at arabcenterdc.org. And we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you, everyone, and take care.
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you.